Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. This is the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership webinar. Dr. Kevin Wehrly will be presenting today on getting the most out of the Midwest Glacial Lakes Conservation Planner. My name is Joe Noner, the coordinator for the partnership, and I'll be the host for this webinar, which means I'm going to say a few words while we get started and wait for people to join on, and then I'll turn it over to Kevin, who's the star of the show. So the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership is an 8-state partnership. It includes government agencies, nonprofits, universities, and individuals who are interested in lake conservation. Our mission is to work together to protect, rehabilitate, and enhance sustainable fish habitats in glacial lakes in the Midwest for the use and enjoyment of current and future generations. And so the partnership does a few things. We conduct scientific assessments to determine conditions of fish habitats and threats to them. And that's what Kevin will be presenting on today. We try to enable partners to complete on-the-ground habitat conservation projects through our grant. And we conduct education and outreach to improve understanding and spark action for fish conservation. And we also provide a forum for those seeking inland fish habitat conservation to share their strategies and resources. So this webinar series is our first attempt at trying to do that last thing. We're starting a webinar series. Kevin is the kickoff. And if you see on the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership website, we now have a webinar site. And if you are interested in future webinars, we'll continue to post webinars to that site and encourage you to consider registering for those as they come out. We'll also be announcing those in our newsletter. So if you want to follow along with the partnership, I recommend signing up for our newsletter, which you can do on the website, midwestglaciallakes.org. You can follow us also on Twitter at MGLFHP. And then, of course, stay in touch through these webinars. Today, we'll be presenting on the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership's viewer, the Conservation Planner. And that planner also is now housed on our website. So if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to go to the website and pull up the planner and explore it while Kevin's talking. The last thing that I'll mention is that the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership runs an annual grant, and the purpose of the grant is to enable habitat conservation through on-the-ground projects, education and outreach, and assessments of fish habitats. So the request for proposals will come out at the end of July and will be distributed through our newsletter website. So I encourage you, again, if you're interested in the grant, to keep an eye out for that request for proposals, and I will be holding a webinar probably the first week of August to share a little bit more about the grant and to answer any questions that may come up from those that are interested in it. So with that, I will stop talking and get out of the way for Kevin, who is going to share with us how to get the most out of the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership's Conservation Planner.
All right, thanks, Joe. Before we jump into the conservation planner itself, I wanted to provide a little bit of background about the assessment that we conducted through the science and data team, which provides the information that's the basis for the planner itself. Get my presentation to work. There we go. So the assessment was conducted by the Science and Data Committee. It's comprised of scientists from across the partnership, primarily in state agencies. As I said, the conservation planner is a web-based viewer, and the information it contains is based on that assessment. It's also based on interaction from a group of stakeholders that we pulled together. We actually held a workshop last year and talked through what the information needs are among different professions, people that work on lake conservation and lake habitat conservation. Got their input on what their information needs are, and input and feedback on the design of the conservation planner itself. And they were also instrumental in helping us develop a set of management guidelines. What kind of actions and what kind of scale of approach should you take given the conditions of your lake. So this certainly is a group effort, and we appreciate all of you who have helped in the development of this tool. So I'm going to begin by providing a little bit of information about the assessment, and then we'll move, talk a little bit about management guidelines, and then we'll move in and talk about the conservation planner itself. One of the challenges that we have in managing Midwest glacial lakes is that we have a very abundant and diverse resource. There are over 40,000 lakes in the partnership that are 10 acres and larger. And even at the state level, there's a large number of lakes that each of the states has to conserve and manage. And that presents a challenge of, with limited resources and time, we need to be able to prioritize where we go and the types of actions that we do. Another challenge is that lakes are complex. There's no simple answer when it comes to how do we, what's affecting a lake and how do we best conserve habitat in a lake. And that's because lakes are influenced by factors that operate at multiple spatial scales. And this slide tries to represent that at the lower left. We typically think of habitat in this sort of local view of things adjacent to fish, such as woody debris. But we also know that things that go on in the shorelands around a lake also influence the availability of different habitat types. They definitely influence conditions, habitat conditions in a lake. Habitat conditions in a lake are also influenced by what's going on in a lake's watershed. So what's going on the landscape can influence nutrient delivery and sediment delivery and water quality, recruitment of woody debris and other things. And what happens in a lake, what kind of lake you have also is influenced by regional factors. This is a map showing the mean annual air temperature across the partnership. This boundary is the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership boundary. And you can see that there's a broad range of climate across this region. And even within individual states, there's a fairly broad range of conditions. And this leads to differences in lake types across the region. And those are things that also influence what we see at the local lake level. For example, the lakes in the northern part of the region are dominated more by perkets, walleye, and yellow perch, whereas the southern lakes are dominated more by centrarchus, bass, and panfish. And so that should also influence our expectation for how we manage habitat and the target species we are managing for. So it may not always be fruitful to manage habitat for walleye in the southern parts of the region if they're really limited by the climate of the region. So these are the types of things that we want to try to account for in thinking about our assessment and tools to help inform management decision making. We want to account for this the multi-scale nature of lakes. And really what we ideally want what we've designed the assessment to help provide information for is about the types and the locations of waters in the partnership. What kind of condition are they in, and how resilient are they to anthropogenic change? Because that might influence also where we prioritize our efforts. And ultimately, we want to use that information to be able to prioritize where we do work, the kinds of work we do, and where we spend our money. Because after all, we do have limited funding. So a little bit about the assessment. Our approach was to be able to say something about all 40,000 lakes in the partnership. We recognize that we have survey data for a limited number of waters. And so therefore we've adopted a landscape-based approach. It's a map-based approach. It's fairly coarse, but we can use readily available information to say something for all lakes, and we can supplement that information on those lakes where we do have survey information. And the landscape approach allows us to incorporate multiple spatial scales and drivers when we start to think about what kind of lake do we have, and what are the potentially the major issues influencing habitat quality in lakes. To do that landscape approach for each lake, which the circle represents here, we placed a buffer around each lake and called that the shoreland area. That's a 100-meter buffer around each lake. And we summarized information at that spatial scale. And we also summarized information for each lake's watershed. So for all 40,000 lakes in the partnership, we created a 100-meter buffer and a lake watershed, and then characterized conditions in those, and use that information to help us think about what kind of lake we have and the kinds of issues that are really potentially driving habitat quality and issues. The structure of our assessment is as follows. We developed, working with all states in the partnership, we developed a central database and standardized information. We developed those watershed and buffer summaries using a geographic information system. We gathered a whole lot of survey data we could from all the states. That included some water quality data and fish survey data. And then we took those information and developed a series of models. So we have a lake temperature model, we have a lake nutrient model, we have some species distribution models, and we use those models to extend our information to all lakes in the partnership, and to conduct the assessment. And the assessment itself contains information on the following. The habitat suitability for different fish species. In this assessment, we restricted our estimates of habitat suitability to 4 groups. One was a coldwater species group. We had 2 cool water species, northern pike and walleye, and then we also assessed habitat suitability for a warm water species, bluegill. And that gives us some idea of what kind of lake types do we have across the partnership, as to the extent to which they represent different thermal guilds. We use that information about habitat suitability and developed an estimate of climate vulnerability for all lakes. So how likely is it that a lake would change in habitat suitability under projected climate change? And then we also characterized sort of landscape disturbance at the 2 spatial scales we talked about, within the shoreland, that 100-meter buffer around each lake, and in the watershed of each lake. We then developed a set of management guidelines. So given the type of lake that you have and its vulnerability to climate change and the level of disturbance that occurs in the shoreland and the watershed, what kind of recommendations can we make in terms of what you should do to manage that lake? And then finally, we developed the online viewer, the conservation planner, to provide that information out to all of you to use to help inform the decision-making process for lake management. So that's the overall structure of the assessment through the conservation planner. And now I'm going to talk just briefly about the components of the assessment and just show a couple of examples, and then we'll talk about the management guidelines and then jump right into the viewer. Here's the results of the habitat suitability modeling we did, and here are the four groups that we talked about: the coldwater, the northern pike, walleye, and bluegill. And you can see that many more of the lakes in the partnership are suitable for bluegill. Far fewer of the lakes are suitable for coldwater species. Now we recognize that these are model estimates. They're not always going to be correct in all instances, and in a practical application, you should supplement this information with any other information you might have about the lake. If you don't have any information, it provides you a starting point to at least be able to say something about your lake or lakes of interest. As it turns out, when you look at patterns of distribution across a spatial scale like this, water temperature and lake size are the dominant predictors that explain most of the variability we see at this spatial scale. So given that temperature is a really important predictor in this, we were able to use future climate projections to estimate future water temperatures and then evaluate how these present day distributions might change and identify then lakes that would be vulnerable to climate change. And for this exercise, we restricted our analysis to the cold and cool water groups here, excluding bluegill, because bluegill stand to gain habitat suitability in the partnership. And so our measure of climate vulnerability is really whether or not we expect a change in suitability for cool or cold water species. And this is what sort of the partnership-wide view of that assessment looks like, with lakes that have high climate vulnerability in red and lakes that have low climate vulnerability in blue. Really, all lakes are expected to change in thermal habitat. And so even the low suitability lakes, or the low vulnerability lakes, are expected to show some changes. But the biggest changes we expect are shifts or a reduction in the amount of cool and cold water habitat shown in those red dots. Moving on to assessing watershed disturbance. In the watershed for each lake, we characterize the amount of agriculture and urban land use for all 40,000 lakes. And we developed some thresholds to identify low, medium, and high levels of disturbance. The low level is sort of 0 to 25%. Once we hit the 25% threshold of development in the watershed, we begin to see issues of excess nutrients in water bodies. And once we get to 60%, so between 25% and 60% development in the watershed, we have some ability to restore conditions in lakes through taking some actions to mitigate the effects of the landscape development. Once we hit 60%, it's really difficult for us to do much restoration. And we really need to think more about mitigation. So that's sort of how we think about those categories and the types of actions that we might undertake given the context of your individual lake. The map on the left shows the land use, patterns of land use across the partnership, with brown being agriculture, red being urban, green being forest, and blue, the light blue are wetlands, and the dark blue, of course, are lakes. There's a large spatial pattern in the partnership and within each of the states. So it's important for us to account for this, and you'll see in the viewer that we're able to do that. So when we map these this level of disturbance out across all lakes, this is what it looks like, with high disturbance in red, medium disturbance in the pink, and low disturbance in the blue. And as you can see, that pattern follows very well the pattern of land use we saw in that previous map. So clearly, lakes in the northern part of the partnership are under really different constraints and pressures than lakes in the southern part. We might tailor our management for fish habitat accordingly. Looking at disturbance at the local level, now we're looking at the 100-meter buffer around each lake, what we call the shoreland. Again, we characterize the amount of ag and urban land use, and we developed a different set of thresholds for the shoreland. And so low development is low levels of disturbance are 0 to 10%, here we begin to see ecological effects when we have about 10% of development in the shoreland of lakes across the partnership, and 30% is the upper end, beyond which it is really difficult to do a full restoration. So it's similar to the watershed disturbance scale, but it's a much smaller amount of development, has a more significant ecological effect in the shoreland of lakes. And here's looking at those patterns across the partnership, again with levels of high disturbance in the shoreline in red, medium is the pink, and low levels of disturbance are in the blue. And again, a strong spatial patterning here, but there's a lot more lakes in the north that have medium and high levels of shoreline disturbance. Not surprising, it's highly desirable to live around lakes, and many of our lakes are developed. So that's a quick run through of the elements of the assessment. I'm going to talk briefly about the management guidelines. So how do you take that information and develop some strategies? And this is a table we came up with, again, working with our stakeholders. And on the left here, we have watershed disturbance categories. So again, low, medium, and high. And here is the shoreland disturbance categories, low, medium, and high. And these are the management recommendations, where these are rough estimations of how you should allocate your effort towards protection in blue and rehabilitation and mitigation in yellow. And we've kept these at fairly rough, kind of rough guidelines, because we didn't want it to be overly prescriptive. But we do have specific recommendations for what protection is, what you should do, or what your options are for protection, and what options you have for rehabilitation and mitigation. So in the low disturbance categories, you can see we recommend to put the majority of your effort into protection, with a little bit of effort towards rehabilitation and mitigation. And you contrast that with the high levels of disturbance, both in the watershed and shoreland. Majority of your effort should be spent on rehabilitation and mitigation, with a little bit of protection trying to protect either those areas that you've rehabilitated or protect any remaining areas that have not been developed. And these management recommendations have been incorporated into the viewer, and we'll look at that next. All right, I'm going to switch screens now. Okay, when you open up the viewer, this is the splash screen you get. And please read the disclaimer. It only works best with certain browsers, and we do have some workarounds if need be. There is a user manual you can go to get additional instructions, and you can always contact Joe if you have additional questions. Okay, so this is the viewer itself. I'm just going to walk through some of the different features here. All of the lakes here are now depicted on the map, and we're able to go in and change these broad scale views. For example, we can look at the disturbances we just talked about. We can look at patterns of watershed disturbance. And in my presentation, I just took screenshots of this. So that's what we're looking at here. You can also look at patterns of shoreland disturbance across the partnership and climate vulnerability. You can look at suitabilities for individual species and different time frames. So let's look at the current suitability for cold water species. And here we say likely or unlikely, and most of those blue dots are in the north. We can zoom in to see those. We can identify lakes that are likely to support cold water species, and then we could also look at whether or not they would support those cold water species would be supported in the future. And then we can also look at management guidelines. So if you were interested in knowing what lakes we should be prioritizing for watershed protection, those are the lakes that show up here in blue, based on our assessment and management guidelines. All right. It also has some options for filtering out what lakes you want to look at. If, say, for example, you were interested in just seeing the Minnesota lakes, you can click on that. If you wanted to do some additional filtering, either by county or watershed or by ceded territories, you can do that as well. If you wanted to, say, look at large lakes, so lakes 1,000 acres and larger in Minnesota that have low levels of watershed disturbance and low levels of shoreland, there. So this is large lakes in Minnesota that have low level of watershed and shoreland disturbance. And so here's your you've now identified those in the map here. Okay. So different ways of selecting out the data if you're interested, especially if you wanted to make a map and share that with someone else. For example, if I had clicked on this when I had zoomed in and done my filtering on the Minnesota lakes with low disturbance, I can share that view with somebody else, so a colleague, so we can have a discussion about exactly what I was looking at on screen. Where do my lakes go? Tall beard. I don't have it. Yeah. Looks like our connection is slow right now. Maybe I'll reload. You must all be using it right now while I'm talking. There we go. Change the background. Map here to help either make things clearer to see, easier to see, or you can also investigate things like the land cover associated with your lake. And we'll zoom in here in a second and look. If you're interested in the ecoregions, you can see those. Topography, and then of course imagery is also available. And we also have the ceded territories mapped on here as well, so you can know whether or not your lake is within a ceded area. Now, the bottom part of the viewer here provides some detail information about individual lakes. And so if you're interested in knowing something about a particular lake, we do have some search functions. Where should we go? Ovid. We'll go to Lake Ovid, and you can see as soon as we click on the lake that the dials begin to spin. You get a little pop-up box that gives you a little bit of information about the lake, the size, the county, the watershed, and the ID. But then over here you can see that it gives you information about the likely or unlikely suitability for different species. So Lake Ovid is currently likely suitable for bluegill and northern pike, but due to climate change. So it has a high climate vulnerability assessment there. Now, associated with each of these are these question marks, and they provide more information about what each of these metrics are, how they were developed, and how you might interpret them. So you can click on that and get additional detail. If we move over to watershed disturbance, we see that Lake Ovid has 58% of its catchment is developed in either ag or urban land use, and that puts it in the medium disturbance category. And the associated watershed management guidelines, other issues associated with landscape development in Lake Ovid. Shoreland disturbance, although Lake Ovid is near Lansing, Michigan, a population center, it has a modest amount of shoreland development. It is at 28%, which puts it in the medium category. But and the management guidelines are similar to the watershed, where you put more of your effort into protection. We also provide some additional detail information for each lake. So if you click on this tab, the watershed detail, and we'll focus on the table over here. This provides information about the different land uses in the watershed and whether or not they are protected. And here in blue, the blue are the protected, so dark blue is forest, wetland, and grasslands that are fully protected. Do we get a total fully protected? I can't. Right here. Okay. So we end up with 26% of the watershed for Lake Ovid is fully protected. None of it is partially protected. And we could see that 73%, there's a lot of the watershed is not protected. There's no protection in a lot of that watershed. So there's a lot of room to for protection, and most of that is going to be in wetlands, wetlands and in forest. This graphic also provides similar information, and our plan is to develop a lake report. So when you click on a water body, you will get an option up in tools where you can click and be able to download a PDF report that provides you the summary of the suitability, climate vulnerability, watershed and shoreline disturbance, as well as details on the different land uses and whether or not they're protected or not. So it gives you information to begin planning with the most appropriate or developing appropriate habitat management strategies, whether it be protection or restoration. Now, we can also zoom in on Lake Ovid and use that information to help kind of think about what we might propose to do on this lake. And we can see that it is in a state park, and that's why there's not as much development around the shore. We can put the land use map on here, and eventually we will have a lake watershed that will appear in the report when you download it, and you'll be able to get a sense for what the distribution of land cover types are in your watershed, lake's watershed, where the protected areas are. So you might want to focus on certain parcels or certain portions of the watershed that would provide the most benefit towards restoration or protection. Yeah. So we can look at another lake that has maybe really different characteristics. Give me a lake. Wrong one. All right, so this is Torch Lake, and here very different type of lake. Turns out it's Michigan's deepest lake. Has very low watershed disturbance, and the major recommendation is to allocate most of your effort towards protection. But it does suffer from shoreland disturbance issues, and additional rehabilitation and mitigation is warranted there. One of the things that we've done recently is conduct a new assessment on Cisco lakes, using more detailed information on a subset of lakes and some more sophisticated modeling. And we have more robust a more robust assessment and management recommendations for that subset of lakes. And so what we did in this version of the planner is indicated in this box here, shown in red, if it is a lake that was known to historically support Cisco, we let you know that we do have additional information, and that you can contact Joe to get that. And our goal is to update the next version of the planner with that new information for those cold water lakes that supported and or currently support Cisco. This one, any of them? Does this one show it? And here I just clicked on the information button, the question mark, and it tells you that there's information available and gives you the contact information. Likewise, if we clicked on the watershed disturbance, it tells you what the figure is about, how it was created, the information that went into it, and how you might use that in decision making. Do we have any questions? No. Okay. If you guys have any specific questions, please use the chat feature. The Lake Ovid, yes. So someone asked the question or made a comment that our first example is a man-made lake, and doubt if any glacier had anything to do with its creation. So this data set does include more than just glacial lakes. We use what's available in the USGS National Hydrography data set, and that does include some impoundments. And it's difficult for us to pull those out of this. And we made the decision to go ahead and leave them in, because many of these places do function like lakes. We often manage them as lakes, but we do recognize that they're not always going to, they don't necessarily represent glacial lakes.
So we got another question from Ralph Bednarz wondering how our results have influenced other state lake quality protection and restoration programs, such as non-point source program support. That's a really good question, and certainly one that we're working on now. Currently, we're talking with the Michigan Water Quality Agency. They've just got a new name. The Eagle is their name, and it used to be the DEQ. And we're working with them. One of the things that they're thinking about is instead of requiring watershed plans, traditional 319 watershed plans for every lake to be eligible for non-point source funding, potentially using some of the information in this tool to help us identify which ones would fall into the least disturbed or moderately disturbed categories, and potentially lightening the watershed analysis requirements and the non-point source pollution requirements, such that it would be easier for them to work on protection. Similarly, in Wisconsin, I've had conversations with some biologists out there, and I'll be attending a meeting in Wisconsin this June to offer a presentation of this viewer and to talk through potentially how they might consider implementing it. But of course, Kevin and I are fisheries biologists that both work for the Michigan DNR, and so we aren't the ones that will make those final choices. We just are providing support for the people who do make those choices.
Where is that? I don't see that.
So Eric Olson asked if we can discuss in more detail the specific actions that fall under the Protect Management Guideline. So what are the range of things that local folks ought to do when working on protection? And one of the things that you can do in the viewer is go to the question mark next to the Watershed Management Guidelines. And it lists some examples. So here it lists examples of protection include acquisition, easement, zoning, and monitoring. For example, if you were doing rehabilitation and mitigation, then you might consider things more like reforestation, buffer strips, building engineered wetlands, stormwater detention ponds. So we have a brief outline of the types of activities. And one of the things that we want to do within the MGLP over the next year or so is build out this framework and continue to add examples of actions that people can take for lakes that fall in each of these categories. And so, working with folks in the partnership and asking for their feedback on that framework is going to definitely be part of our next steps moving forward.
Another use of this kind of information, and I should have said this from the beginning, Minnesota does a really good job of they have a framework for lake conservation, and it involves identifying lakes of high value, and in their case it's Cisco lakes, and they work to identify those lakes that have relatively low levels of disturbance, and they have good water quality, and work to acquire lands or get conservation easements on those water bodies. It's helped by the fact that they have pots of money that allow them to do that, but we've kind of borrowed their ideas for conservation planning and incorporated them into this conservation planner. and the planner itself has why is that still there? Has the ability to or the capability for you to identify those waters. So, and that's doing it at a statewide scale. You could do it at a partnership scale, or you could select waters at a county level or in a particular watershed.
So, Greg asked the question. Stearns County, Minnesota is currently doing a comprehensive plan update. And could we give some thoughts and ideas on how this tool could be used to assist in those efforts? Why don't you pull up Stearns County on the filter?
All right, so I'm looking for Stearns County. Minnesota? Oh, it's a big county. Get up there. It's a lot of lakes. Yeah, everything. So what we're going to do is look at levels of watershed disturbance in your lakes in Stearns County. And what you can see, the majority of the lakes have high levels of watershed disturbance. And so, and a limited number of lakes in blue that have low levels of watershed disturbance. So for those lakes in the blue, those might be the lakes that you target for watershed protection. You want to keep those lakes from turning into the lakes that are pink and red. So there may be opportunities in those blue lakes those lakes that show up in blue to do additional protection. And you can then click on individual blue lakes. And there you can see that this Beyer Lake has low watershed disturbance, shoreland disturbance. There may be some opportunities for, well, there's not very much in the way of protection right now. Looks like it's mostly water and forest. It's private, you know. Yeah, so here the strategy would be to work towards conservation easements with private landowners to help protect part of that watershed, to stay below that 25% watershed disturbance threshold. The lakes that are in the red, you may those present a challenge, and you may want to work towards developing some best management strategies, best management practices to help mitigate the influence of watershed development. And I'm assuming it's mostly ag. Yeah. Wow. So it's clear you have a limited number of places that really you would want to do a lot of protection on, and those you might prioritize those to keep them in in good condition. And then, of course, the light pink ones are where you might be doing a mix of best management practices and rehabilitation as well as protection. It's sort of develop a portfolio of approaches depending on what kind of condition your lakes are. And then you might, even within those, you might, given that you have so many lakes, you might say, really, we can only do so much, and we're going to focus on the bigger lakes because they're of higher value. And so perhaps you filter out lakes. I just did 500 acres and larger. So obviously your lakes that are in good shape are smaller lakes. Those are some ways that you might use this information to help think about what you might do on what water bodies and how you might prioritize. You could also prioritize based on suitability for different fish species would be another way.
Yeah, and then the other thing I would add is you could use the shoreline disturbance to inform where you do shoreline restoration programs and where you do education and outreach to help target more protection-oriented programs as opposed to restorations. I would answer Ralph's question.
So Ralph asked if there are any plans to incorporate trophic status into the viewer, and have we looked at the satellite remote sensing work for transparency and chlorophyll that Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan have developed. I think in the future we'll consider pulling that information in. We have worked with some of the folks that have developed those relationships between the satellite imagery and in situ measurements, and we have used it in an assessment of sort of changes over the last century in the Midwest glacial lakes. So I think it would be an excellent thing to add in here. So we could, I think, look for that in later releases. Is there any other questions? Any last minute questions? Is there any way to connect? Yeah.
This is Joe. Patrick Goggin asked the question, is there a way to connect the viewer to local lake management planning efforts underway and the efforts of local lake organizations? And I think, one of the answers here is trying to make sure that this viewer is available to the lake associations and local units of government or lake managers, so that they can use them. And so, we're doing our best, and we encourage you all to share this planner with them. The planner, of course, provides one set of information, but it's a supplement to existing data. And so sometimes these local folks who have been working with a lake for decades, if not centuries, in their organizations, have a lot of history with the place. And so it's important to add it into the context and not to we're not proposing that it be the only source of information. We recognize that there are other sources out there. So that said, I think tailoring which actions you do on which lake is one of the better uses on the lake specific side of things. And so, if you've got a lake that is, highly disturbed, then you may want to be doing more mitigation versus if it's a lake that's low disturbance and the watershed, then you might want to be doing more protection oriented activities. And similarly on the lake shoreline. But I think that would be the quick answer. And again, the more expanded answer in terms of what specific recommendations would we offer is something that we're looking to develop within the partnership moving forward. It's 3 o'clock, and so we've got one more question, and then I think we'll wrap things up here. Of course, if anyone else has questions, you can type them in here, and we'll either follow up directly or we'll get back to you via email later on. So the last question that I see on here is, will this conservation planner become one of the scoring categories when applying to the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership's grants? That's a really good question, and what we're going to do is revise our grant process over the next 2 or 3 months in order to incorporate this information into our request for proposals and to how we evaluate. Of course, as I just said, this being a landscape assessment, in some cases there's additional information that we don't have within this viewer that is valuable for interpreting what ought to be done on a lake. And so, our plans are, as we implement it for our grant process, to allow applicants to justify the management actions that they feel are appropriate for their lake and to provide evidence for that approach. So this will provide a framework for us going forward, but it's not necessarily all-encompassing, and it's not necessarily the end-all be-all. There's room for consideration of additional information that we may not have here in order to make the final decisions. For example, we get a fair number of connectivity applications where people are, Minnesota DNR has received a few of these where they're either removing a dam or replacing a culvert or installing a rock ramp behind an existing lake level control structure. And of course, we don't have barriers to connectivity as one of the disturbance categories in this viewer, and so we can't evaluate that at this point, and would rely on the applicants to tell us to make their case. Okay, well, I think that's all the questions that I see on here live. Thank you for attending. Again, we encourage you to sign up for the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership's newsletter and to go to the website to continue seeing information about our webinars, etc. Expect to see a webinar on the Shoreland Stewards Program from Julia Kirkwood in July, and then a webinar from me on the grant in August. So with that, thank you all and have a good day.